I'm the founder and director of WNY Education Alliance, which is a nonprofit dedicated to improving outcomes for students in Western New York. And we're hosting tonight's event with the National Parents Union and WNY LIT, which is a teacher learning group in Western New York. And while we have been very focused and are still focused on evidence-based reading instruction for the past few years, it's really time to expand this conversation to include evidence-based instruction, period. And this includes math. And we're so lucky to have two of the very best researchers in the field here with us tonight, Dr. Amanda VanDerHeyden and Dr. Ben Solomon. I'm going to give them a quick introduction. Dr. Amanda VanDerHeyden is a policy advisor and thought leader who actively conducts research focused on improving learning outcomes for students. She's credited with developing models of academic screening that are widely used in schools, conducting innovative research in mathematics screening and progress monitoring using mastery measurement, and the creation of SpringMath. Dr. Solomon joined the faculty of the University of Albany in 2015, and prior to joining University of Albany, he was on the faculty at Oklahoma State University, where he co-directed the OSU School Psychology Center and helped facilitate implementation of statewide response to intervention. His primary research interests include experimental methods and statistics, intervention, efficiency, instructional time, and curriculum-based measurement. Dr. Solomon teaches the assessment sequence as well as academic intervention. He also directs New York's Technical Assistance Partnership for Academics at the University of Albany, which works closely with the state's educational department to promote best practices in academic assessment, instruction, and intervention for students with disabilities. So, wow, the fact that we have these two here tonight, I don't know how that happened, but the stars really aligned. Joining in our discussion will be New York State Director of the National Parents Union, Ashara Baker. And for those of you who are not familiar with the National Parents Union, they have more than 1,800 affiliated parent organizations in all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico, and a membership of more than 1.7 million. The National Parents Union is the united independent voice of modern American families. They channel the power of parents, families, and kinship providers into powerful policies that improve the lives of children, families, and communities across the United States. NPU has been great partners in our Western New York Literacy Initiative, and now we're working together to turn the conversation to math. In fact, just a few weeks ago, the National Parents Union released their Critical Condition State of Education in New York report. And before we jump in with Amanda and Ben, Ashara is here to introduce her report and really set the stage for what math outcomes are looking like in New York State. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Ashara.
Awesome. Thank you for having me tonight. I'm just going to share my screen. It says I can't share it. I will.
I'm sorry. No. I'm going to make you co-host right now. I thought I did that, but I did not. So, okay, you're good to go.
Good to go. Awesome. So, start here. Hopefully something pops up. Okay, can everyone see this? All right, so this is just a little sneak peek. I do have a QR code that I encourage everyone to scan. It takes you directly to the report. Just you already mentioned some work about the National Parents Union, but every year we release a parent power agenda. This agenda is really informed by our national polling that takes place every year. And the polling comes directly from families across the country. So these are some of the areas that we are looking to tackle and advocate upon: economic stability, innovation within education, developing a connected generation within AI technology, and also confronting climate change. The report itself, here goes the QR code down there, is really outlining a couple things. One, I developed the report because I traveled across the state talking to families, and a lot of families at the time weren't aware of how bad their kids were performing in school. If they did know what was happening, they didn't know who to reach out to. They didn't know how to get additional support and resources. And then the other piece is on the state level, a lot of legislators, a lot of representatives who make a lot of decisions on our behalf also weren't aware of just how bad some of these school districts were performing. But essentially, this report is not to finger point or place blame. It's really to acknowledge the status that we're in within education across the state, and start to talk about what we can do, what are meaningful solutions that we have on the local level as well as the state level. We also acknowledge the leadership through Governor Hochul with the historic investments made within education, but also really pointing to the simple fact that we need to invest in things that are evidence-based and are proven to get our kids back caught back up. Sure, everyone has already seen a lot of these NAEP scores, but within the report, I wanted to, one, bring information directly to families so they didn't have to go through 1,000 websites. So it was really important for me to highlight how New York was faring across the country and then bring it down to a local level across New York State. So this is that. I broke it down with some disaggregated data. Just going to jump into the big 5 districts. So the work that I do clearly is informed by the families amongst the big 5 districts. So I do a lot of coalition building work within Rochester, Buffalo, Albany, Syracuse, and some boroughs within New York City. It was really important for me to share out information that led into math because a lot of people were focused on early literacy, which is super important. But I really felt like there were enough advocates and enough leadership to get the conversation going. So I wanted to focus on math. If you take a look within the city of Rochester, this is where I'm from, you'll see that 4% of 8th graders are proficient in math. And this is the 2023 data. So clearly these students are struggling in high school as we speak. Not much has changed across the state. So you'll look at Buffalo, which is in 13%. You look at Albany, same 4%. Syracuse, 3%. And even within New York City, less than half. That made me question a couple things. One, where were we missing the gap? What was taking place from leaving elementary school going into middle school? And then what investments could we look at with redirecting? Well, some things that were also highlighted within the report had to do with intersecting issues. So addressing the simple fact that we not only are in an educational crisis, but we're also in an economic crisis. So the comptroller's report, and I wish I had the link to post in there, he released a report around childhood poverty, and it highlights that nearly 1 in 5 New York children live in poverty, and more than half of those kids are under the age of 6. It's disgusting because there are actual policies and actions that we could be taking on the state level as well as the federal level with the child tax credit. But it's important to really outline that when we have half of the children living in poverty across the state, how does that align with how we're going to get them caught back up in school? What does that look like in the classroom? I also wanted to acknowledge again the investments within our state budget. So we know that there's money being pumped into the education system. Where the issue lies is where it's allocated and the language and the policies that are based upon it. So for instance, we're excited about the Back to Basics reading plan, but I know a lot of early literacy advocates would agree that it only included $10 million. So that's, and I can be corrected on this. I know it's recorded. I believe that plan would impact 20,000 educators across the state, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a very small chunk of money that's being put into the investment of ensuring that a teacher pipeline is developed with teachers who understand best practices around the science of reading. It's not going to be enough to get our kids caught back up, considering the crisis that we are in. I wanted to do some highlights on some awesome groups across the state. Again, because there are groups on the ground doing the work, not waiting for anyone to pass legislation, or not waiting for anyone to suggest that they need to do something. So for instance, highlighting Buffalo with their the Western New York Education Equity Task Force, that really is probably one of the North Stars that I show across the country to advocates. This task force is comprised of some heavy hitters, people in this coalition coming from all different groups, parent groups, community-based organizations, higher education, but they're there on one aligned mission. They are getting students caught back up. So they have collaborated with a couple of key stakeholders, including the University of Buffalo, to launch a comprehensive tutoring program. I want to highlight tutoring because this is something that I think we have kind of fallen away from, or we assume that can take place anywhere. So their community is really locking arms with their universities and building their own talent pipeline of tutors who are pushing into the classrooms, who are available after school. And this is really going to show student growth in the next year's state assessment. So I'm really excited to see the growth for students in the city of Buffalo. Again, within New York City, another bright spot. Um, they both coalitions have produced awesome programs, one that is around reading, one that's around math. So there's New York City Solves. This one is a citywide initiative, and it's really just addressing that 45% gap that we were talking about earlier around how students are performing within math. Again, everything is aligned with evidence-based curriculum. A lot of investments are made in the classroom as well as in the city, New York City. Same with New York City Reads, all aligned with high quality research-based curriculum, aligned and grounded in the science reading. Another bright spot, the National Parents Union, 3 years ago, as I mentioned, along with doing this report, I really wanted to get people in the headspace of just discussing math. I have always said I've never been a math person, and I'm sure a lot of people feel the same way, but it was really important to have those uncomfortable conversations and to do research. So we created the state's first math coalition that's comprised of parents first and foremost, but also higher education professors. We have retired math teachers, all math enthusiasts, whether they like it or not, we're banded together. So we have looked at some comprehensive legislation that's been passed in other states such as Alabama and Colorado, and we have drafted legislation that we are looking to get implemented across New York State. So we're working diligently, and we have quite a few coalition members, but we're always looking for more. And then lastly, as I do any reports, want to talk about solutions. We don't go in rooms advocating and complaining. We really want to outline where the problem is, where we currently are, and then what we can do. So these are the NPU New York Family Solutions. Our biggest recommendation is around high impact tutoring. There's legislation in the pipeline that we'd love for folks to support and share out with your local legislators. We're always advocating for timely transparency for student achievement. So getting information to families, but information that families can actually understand would be awesome. Again, advocating for the Empire tax credit, child tax credit, both opportunities that you can advocate for. There are bill numbers located in here, and they are also included in the QR code that you can scan. Implementing research-based teaching, targeted interventions. Again, the Right to Read Act. There is legislation that we can all stand behind that we feel comfortable and confident that our kids deserve. And lastly, expanding access to high quality public school choices. This is my information. As always, my call to action, join NPU, join the Math Coalition, get involved. Even, everyone at some point could really use some support within the school and outside of the school. So if you're looking to advocate on a larger level, please reach out to me. And I'm going to kick it off to our presenters once I stop sharing. All right.
All right. Thanks for having us. So we thought this would be a little more conversational, but we also have some content if you want us to kind of kick it off with that, or if you want to.
That would be great. Yeah.
Okay.
Start with the basics. And I just wanted to say to the audience, if you guys have questions, please feel free to introduce yourselves, put where you're from, even what math curriculum, like we were talking about, like what math curriculums are being used in New York State. And we're like, we really should ask the people what they're using. So please feel free to share that if you want, but ask your questions in the chat and I'll be monitoring that and we'll jump in, or you can unmute yourself and ask as well. But this will be a casual conversation. So
maybe if I could just sort of kick us off, Ben, and you can chime in and we can see where it takes us. People will probably have some questions that will come up and maybe new questions. I don't know. It happens sometimes. I just realized I have a crummy title slide because I didn't put your name on it, Ben. That wasn't very nice. I was using something I already had. So let me just pop this up. And Ben, obviously, this is our joint slide deck. And the link is right here for you. If you click on this link, which is in the chat. You don't have to try to retype this. I didn't have time to make a shorter one, but I put it in the chat. You should be able to go to it'll take you to a Dropbox file, and then it will tell you that it's going to take 20 minutes to download, most likely. And that's because there are videos that are included in the PowerPoint presentation that you are welcome to use. If you find anything useful in helping you advocate for better math instruction K-12, we want you to feel free to do that. My contact info is right here on the title slide. And Ben, if you want to put yours in the chat, that's a great idea. Feel free to reach out to me or Ben after our conversation today if you want to continue the conversation. And let's just kind of start with why we're here. I mean, we're here because this was all the news, all the breaking news, and people like me were frustrated by this because this is not new information. It was never a surprise that there would be learning loss. We knew this would happen. And the real story was this. This is the real story. This is educational malpractice that if you look at National Assessment of Educational Progress data, which Ashara just presented for your state, which is 29% proficient in grade 4, what you see is that there's really been no improvement in NAEP performance and the average fourth grader in this country is solidly in the non-proficient range. And the picture is even worse for grade 8. So New York is no different than any other state in the country in that we have had flat, unimproved performance that did worsen with learning loss from COVID, but that is not the story. The story is, even if we go back to our baseline, it's not good enough. This is a personal picture for me of my child when he was a baby and when he graduated from high school a few years ago. But his entire birth to graduation from K-12 experience, no improvement for the average fourth grade kid in this country, which is abysmal. And we know that if you want to produce learning, you have to deliver effective instruction. In fact, that's the definition of effective instruction. It is effective when learning occurs. But when we see children not learning, we still have a tendency nationally and in your state to say, well, what's wrong with the learner? You see this all the time in all kinds of ways. I just did a review for a journal yesterday, and that was the tone of the piece. And my comment is high quality learning produces improvements. And if it doesn't, I mean, high quality instruction produces learning improvements. And if it doesn't, then it wasn't high quality instruction by design. And we know in math, because math is relentlessly hierarchical, we know what milestones children need to hit from the earliest days of their experience by grade 8 to not encounter the economic barrier, the guillotine that it is really for children who cannot do math. This is a major barrier in their lives, and not all children need to have a STEM career if they don't choose that, but poor instruction, K-12, should not be the reason they don't have that option if they so choose it, okay? And the number one predictor that you will not complete a 2 or 4 year college degree in any academic major is whether or not you have to take a remedial math course. So most kids are on track to have to take a remedial math course in this country. So this is a very significant national problem. And I love this paper from 2019, which showed that if we focus on the wrong things, we will get no benefit. And there's a lot of discussion nationally about calculus versus not having calculus and having alternate paths for students in math. And in some of that discussion, I get it, it's meaningful, but in some ways it can be a distraction from the more fruitful effort, which is this. And these are data from a great study in 2019 that asked the question, what is the likelihood of children meeting the ACT readiness benchmark in math, given different course sequences in high school, reflecting advanced, reflecting remedial, after you corrected for what those kids can do in terms of fifth grade math proficiency? And the answer is, once you correct for fifth grade math proficiency, there is no difference. So what that means is not that we should not make available more challenging advanced coursework for students in high school in math, but our real work is we have to make those children ready to profit from that instruction. And even in Ashara's opening slide, you can see in New York, all across the state, New York City is quite a bit better actually, but for the rest of the state, you're not in that boat. If only 5% of kids are proficient in grade 8, then by definition, they're these kids. They're not going to make it. They're not going to do well. And that needed to be fixed with excellent K-5 intervention. That's what's lacking. But the silver lining, I like that. Let's come with solutions, is that intervention is very powerful. And these are actually old reading first data, because the science of reading and the science of math are the same science, the science of learning. And we use curriculum-based measurement. We use screening, universal screening in the same way. And we know who's at risk early in their instructional experience. That's the dark blue dot. And if we do nothing but just track their progress over time, this is where they land, versus the kids who are not at risk early on in reading. These are actual data. And those are roughly kind of figure grade equivalents, which I know are crummy psychometrically, but it gives you an idea. And at the end of the day, the kids that we knew were on track at the end of first grade are on track at the end of fourth grade. The kids who we knew were not on track at the end of first grade are still not on track, and they're further off track at the end of grade 4. They're reading at about a mid-second grade level. But here was the great news. The great news of this process, and I could say more about it because this is tied to the old model being called a wait to fail model and the Matthew effect of the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. We know who you are early, and if we don't intervene, you're going to fall further behind. But if we intervene, we give you a good research-based core curriculum, you get that effect. And I'll give you a little spoiler alert of really bad news. The curricula in reading are better for the most part than curricula in math. So math is going to give you a null effect on student achievement in math, unfortunately. But if you take the other half of those students in that risk group and give them high quality intensive intervention, about 40 hours in these research studies, you get this effect. And this performs exactly the same way in math. We see the same rapid benefit. We can detect it right away. It is not true when systems tell you that you have to implement a math instructional approach for a year before you can see whether or not it works. If a vendor tells you that, run away, because that means it's not going to work. This is just a few weeks of growth. You should be able to see it. And then what happens is this benefit chases children, just like risk chases children. Children who are behind in fourth grade are worse behind in eighth grade. But if you intervene, the benefit of what you do in any given year in class, like for example, these are data from class-wide math intervention. If you give class-wide math intervention in first grade, you go from about 52% of students being ready at the beginning of the year, according to an external measure, which is the Acadience Math Composite. The value there is percent proficient. You go from about half of your students being ready for first grade level instruction to 98% of students being ready for first grade level instruction. And the difference between the yellow and the dark blue is that the yellow got class-wide intervention in the preceding couple of years. So the benefit of class-wide intervention is that it removes that immediate risk, and it kind of does what I said on that other slide. It makes children ready to profit from the instruction that they're going to run into the next year. We also see that carry over in randomized controlled trials, and then I'll kind of queue up for questions here, Ben, so you can chime in. But class-wide intervention is a powerful tactic. Anyone can use it. It's low-hanging fruit. It's 15 minutes a day. Ideally, it's 4 days a week as a minimum dosage. But in randomized controlled trials, you get a huge risk reduction. So you're looking at percent proficient on the year-end test for rosters in general ed that were randomly assigned to business as usual control. That's the red group. And the dark blue group, I think that's dark blue, is rosters that were randomly assigned to class-wide intervention, which is a very particular technique, but it is not hard to do. I mean, we do it every day and with hundreds of thousands of kids every day in the United States. So the thing I want to point out is the groups of students. This is an advocacy group, okay? Groups of students who have risk to start have more benefit to attain. And so you can get this very dramatic effect for children who were carrying special risk. So for example, the lower the red, the higher the change. And yet this picture, this is the special ed group. So these are students who are on an IEP, but happen to be on rosters that were either randomly assigned to control or class-wide math intervention. They're otherwise the same. So at the end of the year, kids on IEPs who happen to be in control classrooms had a 41% proficient rate. Kids on IEPs who happen to be on rosters that were randomly assigned to class-wide math intervention had an 80% proficient rate on the year-end test. I mean, Robin Cotting and I wrote a follow-up paper about this and calculated literally what is the number needed to treat? How many dollars would you have to spend to give this benefit to all students? And by the way, when you talk about equity and intervention, I love to use the language opportunity gaps, closing opportunity gaps. This is a picture of an intervention tactic that does exactly that. Because no matter how low you start by subgroup, everybody's roughly finishing close to the same place. And we have more work to do. We still have 16% of kids who are not profiting from class-wide math intervention, but that's a much easier problem to solve than 59% not profiting from class-wide math intervention. And again, it's a relatively simple technique. So when we talk about the science of math, we have a few slides. Ben, do you want to kind of walk people through? I hate to put you on the spot, but I want you to talk about what the science of math is, and I'll show some slides if you want.
Sure, but before we go there, I think it might help to define exactly what class-wide intervention is.
Yeah, so do you want to do it?
I will. It's a little intimidating to do so in front of you, but I will try. Because Amanda is the absolute master of that. But so when Amanda's talking about class-wide intervention, it might sound like an oxymoron, right? Why are we intervening at a class-wide level? Isn't intervention meant for individual students or small groups of students? And of course, I see some of my students are on this webinar. And of course, we've engaged in a lot of overlearning. So whenever I talk about intervention, you are immediately thinking about your RTI pyramid, of course. You can't help but do so. I promised you would dream in pyramids by the time you got through the program. And so you think, right, from tier one, the class-wide level, tier two, individual or small group, then tier three, highly intensive. When we talk about class-wide intervention, we're talking about an instructional program that's a little bit more intensive, that's explicit, that follows a clear routine, and that's layered, and most importantly, layered on top of the core curriculum and aligns with it. So when we talk about class-wide intervention, and Amanda, I love the term you use for that, tier 1.5, we're talking about a situation where we layer a little bit of extra instruction that is sort of, evidence-based, follows all our tenets of high-quality instruction, and is layered on top of that curriculum to sort of accelerate learning for those students where it is merited. It may not be merited. You may have success with your tier one curriculum. Unfortunately, as Amanda was discussing, it doesn't happen very often these days. But that's what we mean by a class-wide intervention. And Amanda, what I also love that you showed here is that not only are and I talk about this a lot with my state level groups. You talked about the closing of opportunity gaps, and it's really important to show here that if you have a student who has an individualized education plan, most of those students spend most of their time in tier one. That is still the environment in which they gain the most from instruction, whether they benefit from special education or not. And so the reason you're seeing that closing opportunity gaps is because when you have students, even if they are struggling in math or literacy, they're still gaining most of their instruction from tier one. So when you add that tier 1.5 on top, even if their standard score is well below, they tend to still make significant gains via that high quality tier one instruction. Tier one still remains the most important learning environment, and you can see that here, which is sort of cool.
And we might mention that it becomes a second screening gate. So part of the reason math MTSS is different from reading MTSS is children, believe it or not, are more proficient in reading than they are in math. And there's, Ben's too humble to say this, but I begged Ben to work with me because for my money, he's one of the best methodologists on the planet in our field. And I'm very lucky to get to work with him. And, but one of the things that we know is just mathematically unavoidable, Ben and I could model it for you, is that if you have a high prevalence of risk, which by definition we do in math, like think about your 8th graders in your state. In some of your areas, you've got 5% proficient roughly. That means you've got 95% non-proficient. Technically, psychometrically, this makes using any static screener a no-go. You can do it, but it's not going to perform for you. If you give a screening, and what many commercial screeners have done is they've made their screening devices easier. They put easier below grade level content on the measures. They're trying to force a more normal distribution of scores, and then they're applying some below X% cutoff, right? Bottom 20%, whatever. And those are the kids who get help. What we're going to tell you is we can explain to you something called negative post-test probability. And that is knowable, it is modelable, and it is driven primarily by what's called your base rate of risk in your environment. So if you got a 95% non-proficient rate, the probability that of a kid passing your screener and under that circumstance and failing the year-end test is very, very high. It's going to get close to 80, 90% with those numbers, maybe even higher. So that means your screening is worthless. Why are you doing it if you can't rule kids out? So that's why you need class-wide intervention. It really becomes, it's not only a way to have rapid benefit across subgroups, and that translates to year-end state test performance improvements, but it's also a way to be much more precise and accurate in identifying who needs intensified instruction, which we call tier 2 or tier 3, small group or individual intervention. Should we talk a little bit about the science of math, maybe?
Sure, why not?
You want to kick us off?
Absolutely. So, Ashara, I think that was a great lead up to this slide. Because of sort of the woefully disappointing results nationwide in terms of how our students are performing on math, there's been a lot of discussion of math reform. And you mentioned how Hochul has injected small, but nonetheless some money, into the situation in New York. We're seeing, incentives and grants and discussion all over the place. And I think it's worth sort of reflecting on thus far what we see going right with those math reforms and what we see going wrong. The aspiration is absolutely there, right? We want students to do well. We understand that students need foundational math skills to have access to well-paying, secure STEM jobs, and that those gates, as Amanda pointed out, can close quite early. We also understand we need to close opportunity gaps, and we need to do that through adjusting our assessment and instruction. I think an area where Amanda and I get a little bit more concerned is now when we get into the specifics of what we're going to do about that problem, now that we all agree it's a problem, you're starting to see sort of a deterioration of the discussion. And this also occurred in literacy as well, right? We talk about classically the reading wars, which I'm sure most people are familiar with, which was basically a discussion about whether philosophy or science should dictate how reading instruction occurs in the classroom. The pendulum swings back and forth, but thankfully right now it's tending to swing more towards science, more towards phonics-based curriculums. Math is a little bit farther behind. We're still having those discussions that tend, unfortunately, to be dominated by philosophy, when in fact there is a fairly rigorous science of math assessment and math instruction, and we understand fairly well how students acquire math skills rapidly based on that instruction. So the same foundations apply, right? We'll get into it, I believe, Amanda, in a few slides in terms of what the tenets are. But if we look at some of the lessons from reading in terms of what generates high quality learning, and then we look sort of more specifically at alternative assessment frameworks and instructional frameworks that are a little bit more specific to math, there is absolutely a science of math that's quite defensible. And as Amanda just showed, and there's a lot more research out there, can drive really impressive rates of learning and math mastery if applied sort of sensibly in schools. And we need to sort of move beyond the philosophical discussions because there's still a lot out there. I'm not going to get into detail now in terms of what those philosophies are or what some of the misbeliefs are or what sort of the pseudoscience may be around math instruction, but it is prevalent. But fortunately, there is a science out there we can rely on.
Yeah, and I think the thing that's, disappointing to me is that even to find ourselves here, because this is not new. So, sort of the prevailing methods of math instruction are at odds with the science of how humans learn and have been since about 2000, roughly. This is not new territory, and is a great sort of policy piece for which influence outpaced evidence. A great living example of that is the California Math Framework. And so if you have read that, what you will find is recommendations and conclusions that, it's not like they're just benign and wrong. They are just like the science of reading. The case that was made very successfully by Emily Hanford or popularized by her, that researchers were identifying those problems for decades, is that these are not simply benign misunderstandings. They are pernicious, they are insidious, they're like toxic mold. They come into curricula, they come into teacher training programs, they come into popular professional development providers, and they're very slow to be weeded out, to be removed. So what happens is we now have tons of math curricula that do not include the ingredients of evidence-based instructional design. That's what we're sort of spelling out for you here. These are things that, regardless of curriculum, these are ingredients that are recommended from the research literature around how children learn math. And unfortunately, there's a body of work, and I think I did put the slide here. It's not one researcher, it's not one paper, and it goes back to 1997 is the earliest article I know of. There might even be earlier ones, but in effect, this is a body of work that is a ringing indictment of the quality of math curricula that are available to teachers to use every day in their classrooms. And we can talk in more detail about this, but just quickly to say, well, what's the result of that? The result of that is that we cannot look to math curricula to save us. And these are the average, effect sizes reported in a couple of research syntheses that were conducted really by the same research group, different lead authors, and with the same findings. I mean, if you're looking for curriculum like Go Math, it's not personal. They all are pretty awful. But if you're looking at that to raise your math achievement in your state, just know it's not going to be enough. You're going to have to supplement. And if you do download the slides, we have given you lots of resources in our slide deck that we hope you will take a look at. And one of the things that we've given you is an evaluation rubric. It's underlined at the bottom of the slide here. And it was developed by a math leader in North Dakota named Kate Anderson, who's quite talented and lovely. And she based it on the Dobler et al. Criteria that I just kind of highlighted briefly for you on the preceding slide. And it allows you to really, as a team, you can look at your curriculum and you can know where are the soft spots that I'm going to have to shore up. And Ben and I could talk about some common ones, right? But you can also just take that rubric and identify specifically what they are in your math curriculum and know how you're going to have to support your students, or they're never going to attain mastery.
I'm actually going to put that into the chat because I actually have that available right here.
Oh, cool. Okay. See what's next. While you're chatting, I'll send people to these sites. These are great. These are my favorite go-to sites. How did we get here? Well, we got here because we have had really ineffective instruction for students for a long time. And we have teachers who have been disempowered, is that a word? They have been made to be afraid to use specific instructional tactics because they have been told that they are not good for students. And some of those things that have been recommended to teachers are not evidence-based. They are not consistent with the science of how humans learn. Things like diminishing the value of practice. Practice is an extremely important technique, and you would not ever want to have surgery with a surgeon who had not done that operation on pieces of that operation dozens and maybe hundreds of times. You would not want to fly on an airplane with someone, a pilot that does not rapidly know how to read all of those buttons and hit the right one given particular circumstances. And you don't get people there by avoiding practice. Practice is what makes behavior what we call resistant to extinction. It means it endures, it is useful. It is actually the birthplace of creative performances. So you can't sit down and make a creative piece on a piano if you are not absolutely what we call fluent or at mastery for those fundamental scales, the foundational skills. And in math, there's sort of this romanticized notion, and it's not unlike what happened in the reading wars, but there's this romanticized constructivist notion that if you give children rich, meaningful tasks, that will help them want to learn the work, and that will produce better engagement. And of course, what we know from science is the best way to increase active student engagement is to give them tasks that they can do, that are at their right level of instructional difficulty. We know that one of the best ways to motivate children to want to do math is to make them good at doing the math. You have to give them something that they can do. You know, if you ask me to do something that I absolutely cannot do, I'm not going to like doing it. That's a normal, natural human reaction. It's so weird to me as a psychologist that we want to intervene at the child level on that, like that's a child problem. I think that's sort of a sign of intelligence in a child, because why do you want to do something? Why should you be motivated to sit for 55 minutes and work really hard on something that you're not equipped to do? So we ignore that when we talk about, math anxiety and how to mitigate that. The most important way you can mitigate math anxiety is to work on skill proficiency. And you can't do that if you avoid practice, for example, to build fluency. So if you want to know some sort of background on what does science recommend in math instruction, we want to send you to the IES practice guide that is linked right here on your slide. It will highlight for you the 6 kind of high leverage must-haves, non-negotiables in your everyday math instruction, the most evidence-based tactics that should be included, and one of which is timed practice. The other one here is the National Center on Intensive Intervention. When you are curious as a parent or as a teacher, what are the effects of this particular intervention program that somebody has recommended to me or my principal has said we're going to do, you can look it up. You can look it up, and it will give you sort of a consumer style rating of the quality of the evidence to support the vendor claims. You can see roughly what effects you can expect if you use it well. Similarly, you can evaluate screening measures in math and identify which have evidence to support their accuracy and which are more questionable. If you have empty bubbles, that would probably be a technique or a tactic or even a set of vendor materials that you might not want to invest in because they don't have good evidence to show that they can work in your setting. And then, of course, there's a site called The Science of Math. It's always surprising to me that this is controversial. I didn't think that the name of it would be controversial. I mean, I understood that was going to be a little provocative, but the idea of it to me is just so logical. And I always say to systems, if you do the things that work, if you're willing to do that, there's time to try other things, to try new things. This is not about dogma. The science is never done. It's always evolving. And really the real thesis of this movement is we believe that all claims about ways to improve learning can be studied, and that studying those claims is a really important part of our stewardship obligation in making use of limited resources to the greatest good possible. We believe it's very possible and probable to get much better than 5% proficient on any year-end test in any grade 8 setting, period. That's not even hard to do. So why aren't we getting that done? And so the science of math is really just not saying there's a specific set of things you need to do, but it is saying we should look to research and we should all avail ourselves of the best scientific methods to investigate what works best for children. What's the most efficient, high leverage way to help children master what they need to. And Ben gave my favorite podcast session on this that he did for a woman named Anna Stockey in Canada. And it's called Chalk and Talk. That's her wonderful podcast series if you want to follow it. We might have linked one. No, maybe not, but maybe we can type it into the chat. And Ben gave her season finale session last spring. And I believe it was like her most listened to episode. And Ben, I just thought you were so brilliant about that. Do you want to make a few comments about that?
Sure, and I do want to comment that it was the most listened to episode until Dr. Brian Ponce got on.
Oh, an Oklahoma colleague. There you go.
Yeah, so he beat me. But yeah, we can put the link to Chalk and Talk in, and Anna does an amazing job on that podcast. She brings in people from all sort of walks of education, whether they be researchers, practitioners, policymakers, developers. And she has them really speak on their perspectives in terms of what drives high quality international. It's an international group too. She brings in people from Australia and I think she has someone from several from England come in.
Yeah, the Netherlands. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really amazing group, and she has all these people speak to their perspective on what drives rapid math learning across the age span. And I think it might be one of the singular best resources for quickly understanding what constitutes the science of math.
Yeah.
I
agree. And her personal story to me is so inspiring. I got to know her years ago before she started her podcast. We were on a panel together, and her personal story is that she's a math professor at a university in Canada, and she had children, young adults, landing in her class as math majors in college, and they could not do basic algebra. And she began to question that and look into what is going on. How are so many children arriving as math majors and they can't do math? And how am I going to manage this as a college professor? And she discovered at the same time her own children were going through the primary grades, and she began to look really closely at their curricula and their homework assignments. And she began to say, whoa, the emperor has no clothes. This is not good for children. There has to be a better way. So she wrote some great thought pieces, and she built a tutoring program that she provided for free for children in her part of the world. She has done tremendous advocacy, and she's still at it. And she gets very fired up about some of these philosophies that sort of diminish or demean and make teachers afraid of doing things that really can work for kids. And maybe we should also comment that, like, if you are a teacher who loves discovery learning or inquiry-based learning, I am not saying you can never do that. I am just saying you have to thoughtfully deliver that in the context of the science of how children learn. So when you give an inquiry opportunity to children, they need to be at mastery for the skills that are required to successfully complete that inquiry activity. And that piece gets ignored, understanding what children in front of you are ready for. You can use inquiry every single day, but you have to adjust your task difficulty. You should be selecting mastery level tasks. The problem is teachers are often taught to use inquiry when children have never learned how to do something yet. And it's deadly when you think about it in that space, because in terms of science and how humans and even animals learn, the learning is compromised if you are allowing children to just sort of wrestle around and try things. They are more likely to make incorrect discriminations than correct discriminations. That's the technical jargon for it. But in other words, they're more likely to misunderstand than to understand. And it costs you twice as much instruction later to fix it.
On that line, Amanda, you talked a lot about the importance of practice, right? And it might be worthwhile returning to that, because there's a bit of a work smarter, not harder, asterisk on it, right? Current math curriculums ask students to do a whole lot. You may notice with your children that they actually have a ton of homework, some of it quite confusing. It's not that that enough practice isn't being offered, it's the nature of the practice that's problematic. Right? So the problem we're having, and this relates to what Amanda just said, is that often we see in these curriculums, they're jumping ahead and trying to compel students to practice on very difficult word problems, or they're trying to invert problems or have them solve in multiple ways at outset before they've even learned, for example, the standard algorithm, or they've memorized their basic facts. And so when we talk about the importance of practice, one key thing we're saying there is that you need to work students through, and there's no skipping go here. You need to have students be highly fluent on their math facts. You need to have students really have all the foundations down. The only way to do that is through practice. I'm going to just say one of the pseudosciences that I think have become quite persistent in the math world is that sort of routinized math practice is bad, right? That it's boring, that time tests hurt students, that time practice hurts students. The science shows the reverse, that those things, especially when they're done at a very quick clip and done in short bursts, are highly beneficial. And that's the critical practice we're talking about here, to build to higher order skills. And then once we have those foundations down, then to build to, addressing the, complex word problems, or generalizing, to connected skills or whatever have you. The problem is we're missing the foundation to the house very often. That's the practice that we see so often missing from virtually all curriculums. And that's why
and
SpringMath.
I get crazy because I think about, like in some places, like parts of Canada, they don't expect mastery of some of the simpler skills until like grade 5 or 6. And the problem with that is they expect mastery of everything else by grade 8. You'll never do it. So if you want a useful, I'm sending you to my site, but it's publicly available. You can see what, for me, the most essential understandings in math when you're talking about an curriculum agnostic, supplemental kind of, what are the highest leverage skill targets that if you start at kindergarten and you go all the way through grade 8, I think there's 145. And I've laid them out for you in this graphic here, and they all build. But one of the key messages I think people sometimes don't understand when we talk about fluency and basic skill mastery and basic fact mastery, that has to happen pretty quickly, because we also want to build it. The keystone characteristic of fluency is ease of responding. Just so the cognitive psychologists will call this concept automaticity. The behavioral psychologists will call it fluency. They are largely talking about the same thing. And the hallmark of both of those things is ease of responding. Okay. So fluency or automaticity, when you build it in more advanced understandings, then you're opening up the child's capacity to think about what they're doing, to find more efficient problem solution paths. I mean, Ben, this is your point. You don't do this early in the learning sequence and acquisition. You do this in generalization, because when children become really fluent with the computation that the calculation that they're working with, then they can maybe show you 2 or 3 ways to get to a correct answer. That's not as useful to them when they're in the acquisition stage of learning. And the other thing that we know in math, again, it's really sort of settled science. It's rare for me to say that about things, but it's somewhat settled science that conceptual and procedural skill are largely overlapping constructs. We can't really even measure them separately. You will hear a lot of discussion about it, but very few people will define the terms. And I've given you a slide in your slide deck where I've given you a couple of definitions and a link to a glossary that the Evidence Advocacy Center has put out. And it's pretty behavioral. I mean, full disclosure, I wrote it, Ben edited for me, but I couldn't get lots of cognitive psychs to weigh in. But when they do, we'll change it, we'll modify it, we'll improve it. It's not intended to be anything except a working document that everybody can sort of pay attention to, because if you don't define your terms, you can't even have a conversation. And conceptual understanding, procedural skill development develop in tandem. Children need both opportunities every day at all stages of learning in order to reach math mastery.
And I think we're finding a lot of the curriculums are so excited to jump to conceptual understanding and really dive into it at the expense of driving up fluency and the procedural knowledge. And that to me is one of the critical mistakes we're seeing across them, that possibly is driving some of that, that struggle with math. As we're teaching, for example, what addition is, while we're trying to teach the concept of what summation is, we don't hold the instruction on our one-by-one addition problems until we perceive students to master the concept. That's not how you do it, right? You have to start driving that procedural knowledge very quickly.
Right.
Get those skills going. And as Amanda was just saying, they actually have a reciprocal relationship with each other. Right? As students build their one-by-one addition facts, right, they're going to start understanding the conceptual basis of what addition is. And then that's going to feed higher order skills. And so one key issue and this is good for people to know because they can review this with their curriculums. If you see curriculums that are really driving conceptual knowledge up front at the expense of the procedural knowledge, that is inevitably going to result in some problems.
That's right. But there are so many teachers out there. Like this is why the science and math group got together, which is mostly researchers, is where it started, is because we would go out and try to help schools improve their math outcomes. And we would run into policies in schools that are at odds with the science of how children actually learn math. So things like, well, we don't do any timed activities because they cause anxiety. Or, we do not allow the teaching of algorithms in first grade because it interferes with conceptual understanding. That is not true. That is actually the opposite of what the science says. And then there's a little bit of if you follow the arguments in social media, the other side will say, oh, so you're saying just drill and kill kids. No, we're saying do both every day. There's real settled science. In fact, I do have a video that shows how to integrate conceptual and procedural skill development. If people want to see it, we can certainly show that, or we can have maybe Ashara and folks could ask us questions if you like.
And Amanda, we like to call it drill and thrill.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Well, I see that Sean Morrissey has his hand raised, and then we'll go to Louise. I know she put a question in the chat too. So Sean, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, so even with fluency, most districts don't even have addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division fluency benchmarks. And recently our district a couple of years ago started, but I'm a 5th grade teacher, and our fluency benchmark to for their report cards beyond grade level is 20 correct problems per minute, which is woefully low. You don't have to be automatic to get 20 questions per minute.
Yeah.
So I think more people admin in there are getting familiar with oral reading fluency norms, norms for digits correct or just problems correct. How do we get some of those just benchmarks out?
Yeah, those are well known in the literature. This is not mysterious. So grades 1 through 3, the expectation is 0 to 19 digits correct in 2 minutes is frustrational. 20 to 39 digits correct in 2 minutes is instructional. 40 plus is mastery. And then grades 4 through 6, you want to roughly double the expectation. So now 0 to 39 digits correct in 2 minutes is frustrational. 40 to 79 is instructional, and 80 plus is mastery. Now, there's some more contemporary evidence in this space that we could talk about, but that is not new science. That what I just quoted you comes from a little book called Database Program Modification, written by Stan Dino and Phyllis Merkin in 1977. And that is well replicated science. And the question that it asks is, what is the level of proficiency measured on a timed assessment that forecasts the things we care about in learning, like the child remembers how to do it. They are not making a lot of errors. They're able to have faster learning of related, more complex skills and understandings, which is all of what math is, right? It all builds. So I don't mind, maybe we should kind of use this little graphic.
I would say, like, just being a practitioner in the schools, just being a teacher, less than 1% of teachers, admin will know that.
Right. We have to put the word out. This is part of the problem, right? So we want people to share this information. And I do think in math, you know, I've been doing system improvement in math system-wide since like 2002 in Vail, Arizona. I just gave a talk in Phoenix, and a board member from back in 2002 came to my session. I had to stand in front of her as a brand new PhD with my hands shaking, saying, look at the gains. Will you support this school-wide or class-wide intervention across the school and all of the schools that we'd like to do? And made a case for that, and they said yes. But you know, these are not new solutions, and they're not rocket science. So it is an interesting question. Why is it like toxic mold in schools? Bad ideas, things that don't work are really hard for people to let go of. And it's really hard for people to uptake science. What are the ways that we could do that better? Because like I said, the standards I just gave you came from 1977. Other people have done more contemporary work, myself included, but those are not bad. Those are a good starting place. And in math, it is a little harder than reading. The assessment is different. There's no oral reading fluency equivalent in math. And scoring digits correct is complicated. Now, I've done it system-wide and taught first graders to do it. They score easier problems typically, so it works. But it gets really complex when you're scoring 8th grade math, okay? Because there's so many, there's multiple steps. You have simplified answers, non-simplified answers. So figuring out how many digits equivalent is quite technical. So there are lots of systems out there, I would say, or maybe not lots, maybe that's an overstatement, but certainly there are systems out there that have converted this science to answers correct. But the complication there, Sean, is then your decision criteria will differ for every single skill and by grade level. So now you're talking about potentially thousands of decision rules rather than the simple ones I was able to kind of hammer out to you. But that's the science that the digits correct numbers that I gave you drives these other answers correct criteria. And I can say that for sure for my product, which is SpringMath. It's based on digits correct. We've just done the technical work to convert everything to answers correct. And other tools have done that too, because it's easier to score. You get less error in that process, especially when you're doing more complex math problem solving, which we want systems to do.
It might make sense to backtrack a little here and talk about the science of math assessment, right? So, and Amanda, feel free to hop in here, right? What the science of math assessment shows is that we assess math in a little bit of a different way than we assess reading. With reading, we have these things, and I might be jumping ahead, Amanda, I apologize.
No,
we have these big ticket skills called general outcome measures, and Amanda referenced oral reading fluency. We can track these year to year, and the skills remain fairly constant. In math, we don't have general outcome measures. We have specific skills, right? We have mastery measures. And these mastery measures actually move at a far more rapid clip because math skills are relatively discrete. They change quickly. And so we can't really measure math like we measure reading. There's not constant measures like oral reading fluency that we can just track grade to grade. Students move through the basic operations, right? Then they get into pre-algebra. The skills change quickly, and so the measures have to change quickly too. And using those measures, which students can show mastery on within a couple weeks, and then that's an indication we move to the next skill. That's been shown to be a reasonable framework for how we can track these students' growth. And that's what Amanda was referencing when she was talking about digits correct per minute and answers only. She was talking about tracking those skills on math work. I don't want to call them worksheets. We call them in the business math probes. Calculating the scores, finding whether students have exceeded those benchmarks that Amanda impressively rattled off from memory, and then moving to the next skill. I think it's also worth distinguishing that assessment framework from the one people are probably most familiar with, which is computer adaptive testing, right? For example, if you have a child in the school, you might have gotten an output from the school that shows their iReady scores or shows their MAP scores. And they have these percentiles and these standard scores. The standard scores are virtually impossible to interpret. The normative percentile might give, people are used to, oh, my kid's at the 30th percentile. Okay, I'm not sure that doesn't tell me what they know, but at least tells me what they are in the distribution. So you might see that too. That's helpful. It's nice knowing where your student is in a normative distribution on based on a very large math test. But again, it doesn't tell you what the student knows or where to pivot to instructionally. And so the framework we're arguing for here, where we measure each skill as they're presented in class and tracking them closely and making decisions based on that's what we're arguing should be a reasonable assessment framework, because it tells you how your student is progressing skill to skill, but it also tells you where you need to go.
And some of our research has shown that it performs in terms of technical adequacy, just like a GOM. We can get very reliable brief assessments that are very skill specific, but they forecast how well children are going to do in other math instruction that is forthcoming. So it's the right assessment for the decision you're trying to make. And I just remember, my kids are grown now, but I was on their school board when they were little. And I tell you what, that's all people seem to understand who are not educators is, well, what's the percentile score? And I used to say to the room, guys, it doesn't matter, because all we got to do is change who's in the room and it changes the percentiles. Like, who cares in a way? You can be at the 30th percentile in one setting and be a rock star, or you can be at the 30th percentile and be in trouble. And that's the problem with that framework of decision making. And if I had one impact in the world around screening, I do a lot of screening research, I have over my career, I would try to make a case that this model, at least in math, of saying, let's measure everybody on something and then say we're going to take the lowest performing X% of kids and give them and say that they need intervention. That is a flawed model. Your accuracy will be highly unstable from one classroom to the next, from one school to the next. It is driven primarily by your base rate of risk. And there are smarter ways to operate, and they really do include going back to sort of the origins of curriculum-based measurement, which oral reading fluency is curriculum-based measurement, which were always intended to be indicators of function, right? So if you could read with a certain amount of ease, characterized as words read correctly per minute, then that indicated you were likely, better than 0.90 correlation, to be able to comprehend what you were reading. And so it was a functionally meaningful criterion. I don't care if you're at the 10th percentile or the 40th percentile. If you are below the functional criterion for being able to comprehend what you are reading, then we need to change the difficulty level of the passages you are reading and give you some systematic instruction to build your reading skills so that you can better read grade level content. And the logic is exactly the same in math.
Amanda and Ben, can I just jump in really quick? Ben, I heard you talk about iReady, and there was a conversation in the chat about iReady. And I know at least one of our teachers in the chat uses iReady, I think, as curriculum. I'm not sure. Anyway, can you talk about that and give us your thoughts?
I think Ben should take it because his children are being exposed to this.
That's not fair.
Come on, this is your chance.
It is, but I'm also trying to be appropriately restrained in my verdict here. Yeah, so I mean, in all honesty, I try to be careful because I don't want to disparage different curriculums. There's very little actual, unfortunately, randomized control trials on different curriculums and how they function. So a lot of it is based sort of structurally on what I'm seeing, the different components that Amanda mentioned, my opinion based on the schools I've been in. So I just want to put that huge caveat out there that I'm not speaking from reading empirical research. I'm more speaking based on my informal perspective. Based on my informal perspective, I have huge concerns about iReady. It gets a little personal because it's the curriculum my daughters are currently using. And some of the problems we've just mentioned, I see in that curriculum a whole lot. I see it really drive conceptual knowledge before the students have a solid foundation for procedural knowledge. I see it try to present very complicated word problems to students before they've mastered sort of the standard algorithm on their basic foundations. I see it really try to jump into sort of generalization into new skills without appropriately training for that generalization. My wife is a highly competent elementary school teacher, and I'm a school psychologist that studies math assessment and math intervention. And oftentimes it takes both of us to sit with our daughter and solve basic subtraction problems because the problems just are worded in odd ways. And so again, I'm not trying to disparage the curriculum. Lots of curriculums have problems.
Well, and the better way to say this, there are no curricula that are immune to these problems.
Thank you. That's a
But
better
that's
way.
why it's not personal. It's just that these ideas about how these sort of really constructivist romantic philosophies about how to teach children math have been very pervasive. They're like learning styles. They sound really good at a cocktail party. I've always said, like, the people who like evidence-based instruction, like, we need social skills training. We need a PR team that goes ahead of us because we can make it like boring to anybody without even trying, right? And we use words like direct instruction, which sounds so heavy-handed. And it's really, if you've ever seen explicit instruction, or which is a PR makeover for direct instruction, if you've ever seen it in a classroom, it's not heavy-handed. It's not the teacher talking at a group of students. It's a high level of engagement, a high level of opportunities to respond. There's a dynamic nature to not just the instruction, but the changing of task difficulty based on how well still children are performing. So there's, and if you notice in the IES practice guide, they call it systematic instruction. It's like we can't find the right words, but it's not personal. I don't think it's unfair for you to say, based on the data, that I am not aware of any general math curriculum that will give you a high or even a moderate effect size on student achievement in math.
And so what was interesting in the district my daughter's is in is they did change curriculums recently. So it was almost like a quasi-experimental test, right?
Mm-hmm.
We got a couple years of stable pretest, and then they introduced the curriculum and we saw the reaction. And I was sort of blown away by how quickly, I mean, I didn't see all my neighbors' standard scores, but all of a sudden we joked about it within my neighborhood. It was all of a sudden a public health concern, math anxiety that didn't exist before that curriculum was introduced. All of a sudden, all the first and second and third graders in the neighborhood were very anxious about their math homework and their math performance, and it didn't exist before that.
Right.
The other thing that happened concurrently to introducing iReady is that they dropped the fluency, the supplemental fluency software that they also had been using with those students. So I think Amanda, you might be familiar with. I think it was called SpringMath with the X.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so they had extra math. My daughters would go on it, Amanda, we did use SpringMath a lot, just so you know, but the daughters, my daughters also, use extra math because that was expected, as, in the school. And it was a very simple, sort of, just quick fluency, drill practice through the basic skills. It would track what students mastered, what they didn't master. It would eliminate the mastered problems, and then once they mastered, a certain skill, it would move on to the next skill. It was very simple. I'm almost overstating what it was. But even that small amount of practice, I think, made a huge difference cumulatively for those students. So when they introduced iReady, and I forget what curriculum they were using beforehand, and then they dropped the extra math.
Yeah, the double whammy.
Yeah, it really was. And all of a sudden, and I really was blown away by it, virtually overnight, you saw the attitude of these students change.
Right. And then, of course, the tendency of adults is to talk about anxiety like it's a child-specific problem. It's not a child-specific problem. And if a number of children share that suddenly, that is always an indictment of the learning context. There's something out of whack in the learning environment. And Robin and I did a study looking at, because Robin Cotting has become a really, I think, important math researcher around math anxiety. First of all, she's brilliant. She's a great researcher, but she's done a ton of work around math anxiety because she also was running into schools that would say, well, we can't do this timed practice because it causes math anxiety. And she's like, wait, where are you getting that? That's actually, let's go to the literature. Let's look. And now there have been some really great experimentally rigorous trials demonstrating that, in fact, that is not the case. That is a misunderstanding of what the evidence says. And math anxiety is real, it's important. But one of the things that Robin and I studied in a single subject design was giving children misaligned instruction support versus correctly aligned instructional support according to the instructional hierarchy. So what do I mean by that? Kids who needed acquisition, we gave them fluency building. Kids who needed fluency building, we gave them acquisition. And we knew what would happen, or we had pretty good evidence, a hypothesis about what would happen in terms of their learning. And that did happen as expected. But what we were also interested in is what would be the experience of anxiety for those children. So we measured anxiety under all kinds of conditions with these kids. It was a single subject design, so lots of data points for a long time. And we found that math anxiety for some children, about half of the children in this study, was worse when they received the wrong kind of instruction. So we're underplaying math anxiety is important, but you don't just, to your point, I would suspect that some of those children experienced a very normal reaction to being given instructional tasks that required them to attempt and try things publicly that they had not been taught how to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Amanda. I just wanted to jump in and say that Mark has a question, I'm guessing related to this, so.
Yeah, I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about the effectiveness of the use of direct instruction versus the application of the different elements that you're talking about through the science of math, like the number of digits correct per minute, or are they even separable? Because I know our district doesn't have, it really emphasizes that constructivist approach. I'm wondering if they can even be separated.
Well, do you want me to try to answer that, Ben, or do you want to
try this since the other times to carry on?
Yeah, so I mean I can start and Amanda hop in. So yeah, the acronyms you get a bit of a letter soup, right, with all the different acronyms. And so let's separate them out, right?
Brush my teeth for that a little bit.
You have
No, it's yes, I have.
Let me unmute myself there. Okay. So let's separate out the different acronyms, right? First, you have DI, right? And you have two variants of DI. You have capital D, capital I, and little d, little I, right? Capital D, capital I refers to a program developed by Engelman and colleagues, right? That's routinized and is a very specific suite of curriculums. And then you have little d, little I, which more refers to an approach to teaching, right? Where there's a heavy emphasis on scripted planned instruction, assessment, modeling, all the things outlined in what was Amanda? What was it? Was it the What We're Stirring House that published that?
IES practice guide?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I
So
was confusing
they
too.
call it systematic instruction.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have that, and then you have explicit instruction too, which is sort of a bit of a synonym there, which again covers all of high quality instruction. So where does the digits correct per minute fit into that? That's not linked specifically to one framework or the other. I mean, I don't believe so. It more just follows under a well evidence-based practice that would probably fit under the little d, little I, or explicit instruction framework, constantly assessing your students, knowing whether on a very clear outcome metric with intuitive understanding. That digits correct per minute, unfortunately, you don't see it present. It's not really baked into any specific curriculum I can recall. It sort of stands external to it.
Yeah. I think, so we might have folks on this in this presentation who are really aware of and excited by what cognitive science has to say about how learning happens. And I count myself in that category too. I'm a behavioral psychologist for sure. That's my training. But I have friends who are cognitive psychologists. And if you go to Research Ed, like Research Ed is kind of a conference that is built by teachers for teachers. It's very heavy on what cognitive science practices refer to as things like retrieval practice, okay? Well, the idea of retrieval practice is not novel to cognitive psychology. In behavioral psychology, we call it something else. We might call it mass practice or distributed practice, or opportunities to respond. So we have jargon that is not well translated and connected across literatures. But one of the things that I think is really important and can be overlooked is this idea that we have to assess the students in front of us. Formative assessment gets one of the biggest effect sizes when it is included in experimental investigations. But it only gets that effect size when it very clearly drives instructional changes based on the results, the scores that you get. So this sort of integrated assessment with instruction largely comes out of the curriculum-based measurement literature, but the curriculum-based measurement literature was born in precision teaching. And precision teaching was born in behavior analysis. And then the great students of Standino, like Lynn Fuchs, was mentored by Standino, among other very famous researchers in our field, took curriculum-based measurement, which was originally a very behavioral construct, operationalized, observable, correct responding that we could use to drive instructional changes. And they turned it into more of a score, which became quite beautiful because when oral reading fluency, words read correctly per minute, or digits correct per 2 minutes became scores now that could have properties like reliability and sensitivity to instructional changes, then we could use these assessments that are very brief in real-time environments to drive instructional improvements. And so like a lot of the early studies from Lynn Fuchs and her colleagues demonstrated exactly that effect. When you have that in tandem, I teach a little bit and then I assess whether or not you learned it, and then I adapt my instruction based on that, which is what Dino and Merkin described in 1977. That's the magic of learning. And what I think Ben and I would both say, we've written together on this topic, is that science is often lacking, and it would add a lot to any environment that is attempting to install evidence-based practices instructionally. So if you go away and you learn, let me use incremental rehearsal, or you go away and you learn, let me do concrete representational abstract sequencing in my math lesson, or let me add daily retrieval practice, or let me do class-wide math intervention. If you do class-wide math intervention, the assessment's built in because it's all I know how to do. So that part's controlled. But if you're using a tactic like more kind of generic, like retrieval practice, you have to add some assessment to tell you whether or not children are ready for you to advance the task difficulty in the retrieval practice. And it's not hard to do, but I do think, I mean, when I went to Research Ed last year in Toronto, That's what I was thinking about in the audience, because I presented, but I went to all the sessions and I kept thinking, oh, nobody's talking about assessment here at this meeting. We should be talking about, there should be some assessment being discussed, because to your point, how do you know when you've mastered what's in front of you and you're ready to go on to the next thing? Or your students did not acquire the understanding and they are not even ready for retrieval practice or fluency building, which we also see. I mean, when they have not acquired the understanding, and we can give that a score range that tells you that on every skill, then you need to be doing things like more worked models, immediate corrective feedback, prompt hierarchies, things that make it easier for the child to get the correct answer and understand how they got the correct answer. We do not want to give children retrieval practice and fluency building activities that when they are in the acquisition stage of learning and they have not yet learned how to do something. Because in effect, then we would be having them practice doing it incorrectly.
Yeah, I'm really glad you talked about assessments and the Research Ed conference in Toronto, which is where I met you. If you guys, as the audience, have a chance to go to a Research Ed conference, I encourage you all to find one near you and go to it. And I think Mary has her hand raised, and then there are a couple of other questions in the chat that we'll get to. Mary, I think just take yourself off mute. I'm not sure where you are, but.
Thank you. I just had to figure that out.
I know, me too.
I'm on the school board, and we're looking at school improvement plans. And it seems that ideology drives instruction completely. And it doesn't matter, because they're so bound by these beliefs that's all that matters. And one of the school improvement plans for an elementary school was that every day in math class, they would be practicing, try it, discuss it, and connect. And I just thought, for teaching math, how much time is spent with kids floundering together. And they have equated, I believe, engagement with achievement.
But it's not better engagement, Mary. That's the thing, that everybody pretends like it's better engagement. There's a guy named Zach Grishel, who I know you like, Tarja, and he's got a podcast, and he says, he's an instructional coach, works in hundreds of classrooms. And he said when he goes into a productive struggle or a discovery-based learning episode, like you've just described with the try it, connect it, whatever, that you have much lower engagement with students. It's so interesting to me. Like, again, that's why I say, like, there really is a science to how humans learn, but we lost the PR approach to it because this other stuff just sounds so appealing, but the appeal is out of sync with any demonstrated efficacy.
And the other thing that's happening in our district, which I think they should really be trying to connect this, is the behavior.
Right.
And every year the behavior gets worse.
Right.
And in the high schools, many parents are pulling their kids out in homeschooling just because they don't believe it's a safe place. But again, I think if you take kids who are going through puberty, they're getting older, they're getting very knowledgeable, they know they can't read, they can't do math, and what happens? And the other thing is our special ed population is exploding, and we're adding more and more special education classes all of the time. So, and they all seem very connected to me.
They are very connected. And that's not a new understanding. I'm finding you an article right now that I want to send to you that you can read right online. It's called The Right to Effective Education. It was written by Elizabeth Barrett and colleagues. Our friend Carl Binder is one of the authors on that paper. I might not be sending you a free link here, but if you use the link that I send you, you should be able to find it.
Thank
It
you.
it is a dynamite article that really spells out what is the type of instruction that all children really are entitled to. And it was written in 1997. So it really is, calling out the very things you are talking about are not new problems. And to me, it's unconscionable when we know better and we don't do better. But what you're talking about is absolutely going to drive disruptive behavior, off-task behavior up based on the science. It's absolutely going to drive your LD rate up. This is a predictable, knowable effect. I think I said this at an event a couple of weeks ago. There's a layer to this of even if you can stand up and do something really clever that looks really interesting to your fellow math teacher adults who are not novice learners, okay? But even if you can do that, we should be asking as stewards of limited resources, how much time, to your point, Mary, I heard you say that, how much time does that take in the classroom? And then also, by the way, there's a simplicity that's lost, a simplicity of training. So some teachers are going to deliver a clever game better than others. It's really hard to teach teachers to deliver a clever game and take everybody with them. That doesn't mean some teachers cannot do it. Some can, but I'm going to argue those teachers are more rare than we are acting like is the case. So there's simplicity in using evidence-based tactics too, because they are easier to train teachers to do. They take less time, and then you can play a game and the stakes aren't so high, because if the game doesn't work, it doesn't matter. They got what they needed,
Mhm. I'd love to see the video you mentioned too at some point. The one that you said you could show how direct instruction was connected with, or
Yes.
concepts and procedures are taught at the same time. I'm not exactly sure what it was, but
if we run out of time, I'll just make sure that the link is in the chat so you can watch any of those that you like. And I guess also to answer the other gentleman's question in terms of effect sizes, if you look up anything that sounds like what Paul Kirshner would call minimally guided instruction, which that's going to include discovery-based learning, inquiry-based learning, productive struggle opportunities, project-based learning, those effect sizes are fairly abysmal. And interestingly enough, direct instruction has consistently some of the highest, strongest, greatest effect sizes in across the board for all types of learners. I don't understand why people are so opposed to it. But there it is. If you want to be effective in your classroom as a teacher, then just be pragmatic. Do some of what works and then do what you have to because the leaders in your system said you did.
Yeah, and what you're describing, I saw unfortunately all over New York, where you have students transitioning into high school. And that's where it becomes very hard the fact that they're coming in with no skills.
Yeah.
Right. And as you pointed out, these students are not stupid, right? They are keenly aware as they now engage in this much higher order coursework that they're not prepared. And so, they engage in alternative behaviors. And what I personally had a hard time doing as I was doing my coaching and consultation around New York, I was having a very hard time convincing districts that they needed to step back and they needed, if they're having huge problems at the secondary level, they needed to step back into their elementary schools. They needed to race over there and do their forensics and figure out what curriculum are you using, what's the performance, when are they going off their benchmarks, how are they going to supplement, back there. I oftentimes find school districts want to put out individual fires in the individual schools, and they have a difficult time looking systematically at it at a district level to figure out where the sources of the problems are. Now, granted, in those situations, you also oftentimes have transitory students who come in much later, come in and out of the middle school, come in and out of the high school. That's a different problem. But you really want to, if you're having significant issues with dropout or truancy or just overall sort of poor behavior in the high school, I mean, there's different things you need to do, but one of the most critical things you need to do is step back and look at your elementary school curriculum and practices.
Yep. Put the fence at the edge of the cliff instead of the ambulance at the bottom, is what my buddy John Carruth would say. And it's not uncommon for us. We run a lot and study a lot of, and Ben has studied with me, so much to my good fortune, class-wide math intervention. And it is not unusual for us to get a 20 or even sometimes a 50% increase in percent proficient with a year of implementation of class-wide math intervention. This is not really, you would think it would be very complicated. It's not. I built it because I landed in a district and I needed to solve a math problem called Vail, Arizona in 2002. And we were doing this new thing called response to intervention, and I was leading it because that's what I knew how to do as a school psychologist. And we, in the first year, the learning disability rate went from 6% of their population to 3.5%. And they went from middle of the pack on these new year-end state tests, which they were new at the time, from about middle of the pack in the state to rank order position 1. And we did that with the very simple tactics. I say they're simple, but there's a lot of science baked in, which is that there's a very specific sequencing of skill presentation. You're not giving kids practice in class-wide math intervention on skills that they have not yet acquired. So if they haven't acquired it, you do a whole class acquisition lesson first, then you come back to the standard protocol fluency building. So there is quite a bit of science baked into it. And in tandem assessment, you get a weekly progress monitoring score as part that just happens as part of doing the intervention. But that's what we use to move you up or to say you need to spend another week on this skill. But something that simple, which costs 12 to 15 minutes per day in the elementary grades, 15 to 20 in the older grades. Doing that 4 days per week as a minimum dose, it is not uncommon to get a 20% increase in percent proficient. And here's another little silver lining. The lower you are to start, the easier it is to get a bump. Mm-hmm. So y'all have a lot of room in New York. Like, I mean, really, that's something that's like, you should be kind of excited about that, because you could get a huge jump in year 1 when you've only got, like in some of your schools, 5% proficient in grade 8.
Yeah, nowhere to go but up for sure.
And you're probably going to start with 3rd grade skills. I hate to tell you. Yeah.
I was just going to say that Ashley has her hand raised. Ashley, go ahead.
Hi, Amanda, my question is for you. I'm a principal in Northern New York in a district that is implementing SpringMath this year. So I work in a K-4 building. Yay. And we're having a lot of resistance with our kindergarten teachers, especially.
Oh my gosh, okay.
How you rolled that out with kindergarten, just that they haven't learned their numbers yet. They're still babies. This is so hard for them. I'm just wondering how I can work with my team better and with our district assistant superintendent, who's also on here, to help our kindergarten team across the district with this resistancy that we keep facing. Can you guide us through that, please?
Of course. I mean, I hope it's okay to answer kind of a spring math question in this context.
Yes, please do.
I think it's a general answer, because when I say spring math, to me, that's math MTSS, okay? And what you're describing is not unusual. In the 1990s, when I was first doing kindergarten center research using curriculum-based measurement, building new curriculum-based measurements for kindergarten kids, we got kicked out of a kindergarten center in 1998, 99, because we timed kids, and we were using dibbles, and it was brand new back then. And the principal was so offended by that. You will damage 5-year-olds if you time them. And we're like, oh my gosh, what's happening? So this is not new. This is not but it's also a very fruitful thing to help people better understand that learning is fun, and it's fun to learn. And children, when they are able to see their own growth, are very motivated to engage in that academic work. They find it fun and engaging. So what I want to tell you about our work is, in kindergarten, we actually get the easiest adoption. And most kindergarten teachers because we track big data in real time, most kindergarten, the vast majority, like a much greater percentage of kindergarten teachers actually finish our skill sequence. And what I would say is, it's okay if you don't start class-wide intervention in kindergarten on day 1, because it's kindergarten, and because most kindergarten teachers are going to finish it anyway. But we've had so much success in kindergarten that we had teachers all around the country re-rostering kids as 1st graders so they could keep going. And we said, okay, let's see what happened to those kids. And what we found is kids who got some of the first grade content in first grade did much, much better than similar kids who finished the kindergarten sequence, but whose teachers did not continue into the first grade content. And we didn't have a randomized controlled trial, but we had really good data, tens of thousands of kids in the sample. And this encouraged us, because we look at our data all the time, and said we were encouraged to say, I think we can make available some challenge skills at kindergarten. So actually we get so much adoption in kindergarten that we've added to that process. So I think the way, you get around this in all math MTSS, when you're trying to get somebody to try something, expect anxiety. Our next newsletter is sort of focused on some of this. So make sure you're signed up for the newsletter. We have our free quarterly session that you can come and we can talk more about SpringMath directly. So I'm not talking too much about SpringMath with this group, but that is free and available to anybody. You don't even have to be a current SpringMath user, but we unapologetically talk about SpringMath and show you and teach you how to do things inside SpringMath. We do that 4 times a year, and it's coming up the week of November 18th. I think it's that Wednesday. So, and it's virtual. So with your kindergarten teachers, maybe you even want to bring them to our next session, and we're happy to talk about that. But I think like with anything, it's you get them to do a little bit, you support them so they feel successful with it, and then you show them the growth that they get. It's behavioral change with adults. And we even in the newsletter article that I just wrote, I wrote about implementation as a behavior, and teachers can be at the acquisition stage for implementation behaviors. They can be at the fluency building stage, and they can be at the generalization stage. Your teachers are at the acquisition stage for learning. Anxiety is a normal feeling. We don't want them to practice independently. We want them to feel supported. And so there are videos that they can watch of how to do this in kindergarten classrooms. You can ask for your coach, who is part of our team, to meet with you virtually and help, even to meet directly with your kindergarten teachers. I'm happy to meet with your team if you ask me to. But the way you get it done is you get them to do it, and to do enough of it with enough consistency, which is not much, just a week. And you should see everybody grows. And usually that captures a teacher to want to keep going.
Thank you.
Yeah. Ben, do you want to comment? Because you've seen it in lots of schools.
Yeah, no, I think you described it very well. Again, Amanda, I appreciate you don't wanting to harp on SpringMath, but as Amanda very well knows, we were assisting with implementation locally here in the Capital Region. And we watched the entire implementation arc, starting in year 1, where a singular very scrappy school psychologist, really saw the need for this in her low SES rural district. And so she spearheaded this, and now it's in year 3 and fairly stable. But in the first year, as Amanda was saying, as you think about the behavior of the adult, it was really touch and go and very difficult, and there was an incredible amount of resistance. And what happened was, at first, there were a few teachers that were on board and wanted to do it and saw the value. And so they got on board, and the treatment, the implementation integrity on the other teachers was poor. But then the next year, and they saw the data from the first year, and saw that those students who had gone through the entire program were coming in much better prepared. And now that was public data. Now you had teachers who were quite fluent on it, so they could support other teachers. And it was sort of neat to watch in real time. All of a sudden, there was a bit of a chain reaction, where now we're in year 3, and the vast majority of teachers are implementing, and there's still some resistance, and that should be expected. And, we want to hear their concerns, and we want to support them.
But their year-end-state scores have gone up.
Yep. Yeah.
Right,
I'm really excited. We still haven't aggregated the second year scores, and I'm so excited to see them. So it eventually, once the ball started rolling, it did continue to accelerate. So what you're describing is very normal.
Yeah.
I do understand people being concerned that, supposedly with young kids, that there's sort of this myth of what's quote unquote developmentally appropriate. 5-year-olds are excited to learn. And I've done flashcard interventions with preschoolers. They love it. They love learning, and they get excited by what they've acquired. And they are very, as Amanda was saying, they're very capable of also understanding their own growth and even seeing the data and understanding it with some support.
And I put some videos today on, because somebody had asked for some kindergarten intervention videos on Twitter, and you can watch them. With kindergarten, it tends to look like a game, counting activities, and so it's not usually paper and pencil worksheet style intervention. Kids are instead counting objects and identifying quantity. I would almost really say, because I have been leading this work in systems for, gosh, 20 years. If you do not see resistance, your people are not doing it. That's it. Because when you ask adults to do something new, anxiety isn't what you might call, resistance. We could also call anxiety,
Yeah.
Or even a learned response, like nobody's going to pay attention. I'm not going to be supported. I'm going to be asked to do 5,000 other things. So if I just ignore it, this thing will go away because nobody's really paying attention to it. So it could be even adaptive on the part of adults to go, you know what, I'll just wait this one out. This is yet another thing I'm being asked to do that doesn't matter. And we all kind of have to share that responsibility that's a cultural shift, right? To say, we're going to do this thing and then let's all do it together and let's make sure we do it with good fidelity so we can get good results.
Yeah, but and a key absolutely is, and I mean, sorry, I'm just repeating something you've said, is to provide as much support to the teacher as possible, right? I think sometimes we're in these situations where we dump initiatives on teachers, or we dump new practices on teachers, and teachers are, as you well know, are very busy people.
Yeah.
So one thing we tried to do in our district locally is try to model the behavior as much as we could, try to make their lives easier, try to be an ally, really come at it, from a proactive, sort of coaching relationship approach.
Yeah.
Make them feel sort of secure in trying it.
Think about this is part of what I think gets so wrong and is really toxic about discovery learning. If you provide discovery or inquiry learning, and then the student doesn't make the discovery or the learning, whose fault is it? It's the student's fault, right? So I think we should favor instructional models that begin with Keller 1968, the learner is never wrong. If I taught it and you didn't learn, then I didn't teach it by definition. And that does not mean you cannot give, I'm going to call them generalization opportunities. Other people can call them discovery opportunities because I think those are a good idea. But it is ultimately the teachers are leaders. It is their responsibility to lead children to correct understandings and robust performances.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so glad this topic of resistance came up because I think we have a lot of different stakeholders here. We have teachers, parents, board members. If we're coming at it from the idea of resistance, like from a parent perspective where their district is not doing anything. So for instance, in the chat, we had a couple of parents talking about their district. They're using iReady. Both of these parents separately have dyslexic children. They're not receiving any support. What's your recommendation? How do you advocate for change if your district is really not doing anything yet? It's a tough one.
Well, parents have done it all over the country. I think it's okay to get a little fired up. Anna Stockey got fired up. I've seen Ben get fired up. I got fired up in 1998 when I sat in a meeting in South Louisiana and we talked about a little boy who wasn't learning how to read. And at the end of this 3-hour meeting, I counted the adults around the table and it was 16 adults talking for 3 hours. And I called Joe Witt and I said, I'm in the wrong, this is not for me. I just finished my master's degree. I was in a PhD program. I said, I don't think I can do this. And Joe said, well, lucky for you, we're going to teach that kid how to read because we could do it in less than 48 hours of intervention time. So, we just need to make this shift. We need to make this shift. When you see resistance, when you see lack of activity, you have to be willing to say, let's do some behavioral shaping at the system level. Show people what is possible. Let people see the results of their effort in sensitive ways. Like I find it so remarkable that we ask teachers to do hard things and then they get no feedback on how well it worked. Like, oh, adopt this whole new program and we'll tell you at the end of the year what kind of results you got. Well, that's not fair. That's not even professionally respectful. If you ask somebody to do something, you should be able to show them the effects of their effort in the short term so that they will be encouraged to do more. And it's your job to help troubleshoot it, to make sure it's working well.
And I think parents are actually in sometimes a very excellent position to trigger some of that school or district level change.
Yeah.
If you survey your teachers in a school, oftentimes they know exactly what's going on. And they're too afraid to say it because it's their job. It's their principal. It's their superintendent. So they can be understandably a little timid about advocating, but you as a parent can. You're not an employee of the school. So if parents, I think, they want to advocate for their individual students, and that, of course, is very understandable and laudable. But I think parents often aren't informed about sort of the nature of the instructional activities or the nature of the practices that should be occurring. And so I think if you can, you can be a thorn, I don't want to say a thorn in the side, you want it to be positive, but you can be politely persistent. And as a parent, go to your principal, go to the superintendent, go to the school board. School boards are great places to go to.
I think so too.
Go to the Parent-Teacher Association and explain some of your concerns about what instructional activities are going in the school. And I promise you, there's a solid cohort of teachers that will be very happy you do, because they are equally concerned, but it's their job to listen to, what the edicts are. So if you can get some momentum going in that district, there'll be a lot of people, I think, who are thinking what you're thinking. They just haven't said it yet.
Yeah, you're so right. I just noticed Mark has his hand raised, and then we have about 7 more minutes. I want to be respectful. I told people we'd be done by 9. I love that this conversation has been so amazing for so long. So we'll let Mark go, and then you guys can wrap up with your words of wisdom.
Thanks. As a school board member, I want to say, please come to the school boards and speak. And, teachers are afraid, parents are afraid because they see things come back. Even tenured teachers find that they get put into less desirable situations when they speak up. So, but they really need to be encouraged. As a non-educator, advocating for direct instruction and the science of learning, I sometimes get pushback from either administrators or even fellow school board members. You're not an expert. You're not the expert. They are. How do I deal with that?
Well, I was on my kids' school board for 8 years and I got that pushback. So, I just think nobody likes it when you're not in agreement. And school boards often want to find the thing that everybody can just agree with, right? So it's sort of politically expedient. But at the end of the day, I think I like to come back to, well, what's the purpose? What's the mission? And to me, it is stewardship. And it's not a philosophical debate. It's not my way or the highway. It's not dogmatic. It's, can we all agree that we should be about the business of making math mastery, for example, more available to more students? And I think when you have a 5% proficient rate in grade 8, the answer is a resounding yes. And then can we all be about making the little changes that aren't hard for us to make, that we know we can support and get some growth, and then maybe that will spur us on to take on more significant change. Like, to me, I think education leaders sometimes start with something too big, like adopting a new math curriculum. You don't, I all day long, I'm going to say to leaders, you should start with class-wide math intervention first. And as Ben just said, it's hard enough to get that done, but that'll actually be protective to your children as you go through any kind of new program or curriculum adoption. because you're giving them this sort of vaccine against math failure. And that allows teachers to learn the new curriculum and learn how to deliver the new curriculum. Oftentimes scores go down when you adopt a new math curriculum or any curriculum because teachers are having to learn how to do it. And again, in math, as we have said, it's not going to save you. A math curriculum is not going to raise your test scores. I feel for you. I mean, I've been on it was the most thankless job and service I ever gave in my whole entire life. It was a labor of love. I just had coffee today with somebody I served with, and it's been 10 years since I did that. But, and he is not in the business either. And people there's a lot of seductive kinds of statements that are made to people who are not educators or who are not researchers, and they don't know that what's being there, it's snake oil, and they don't know it. And it sounds cool. Like, who doesn't love discovery learning? It sounds so much cooler than direct instruction, doesn't it? Except there's only one problem with that, and that is it doesn't work. Yeah.
Yeah, I've often directed people to Anastaki's actually podcast episodes because I find that actually is the best Reader's Digest of the pertinent issues, and all is very scientific, and people really enjoy it. She plans them so well, so they're 20 minutes, they're not too long, and so I have recommended various school board members and principals and superintendents. I've literally recommended certain episodes to them for that reason, and I'm hoping we're in a bit of a remove. Maybe naively, but we'll call it optimistically, hoping we're sort of moving into a new era, that maybe the reading, the science of reading is paved the way for, right? There is a more discussion about the science of learning now than there previously has been. There's more acceptance that it's really important, and that it can drive outcomes. And so oftentimes when I'm in schools, I try to hitch the math wagon, at least to that thematically. And say, look, you've come to certain, we've already moved so far ahead on what you're going to do in terms of your reading assessment and reading instruction in the school, based on Emily Hanford's, podcast and all that. I said, just apply that thinking now to the other side, right? So you have these philosophical beliefs about how math should run. There's seductive language that Amanda described very well. I said, let's put that aside. We've talked about the science of reading now. It's entered our, pop, it's almost this mass, market term now. Let's now talk about what the science of math is. And, maybe it's different than what you initially presumed, just like which occurred with reading.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
well said.
Good point. Let's bring it back to student achievement, teacher knowledge and student achievement. For sure. Are there any other questions? Anyone? I love the discussion that we've had. I just want to say thank you so much to Amanda and Ben, and for Ashara, for the National Parents Union, for hosting this and talking about their report. But I hope that this is just the beginning of the discussion in New York State. I want to thank all of our audience members from all over. I know we've had some out-of-staters too, so hopefully you found this helpful too. But let's continue the discussion for sure.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's been wonderful. Thank you.
It's lovely to talk about math. It's so important.
Yeah, let's talk about math. And I just wanted to say I will send the recording out to everyone who registered, as well as all the resources that were discussed in the chat.
Awesome. And we have resources on those last 3 or 4 slides. It's all resources.
Great.
So I hope folks will be able to download. I can send you a link to the deck too, if you want directly. Okay.
Perfect. That would be great.
Okay.
All right. Wonderful. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.